A billionaire CEO sat behind glass walls, surrounded by power and silence, until a little girl walked in, ignored every rule, and laid a single crayon drawing on his desk. 6 words, just 6, ripped through his world and exposed what decades of wealth had buried. She wasn't there to beg. She was there to be heard. And what she said next didn't just change his company. It sparked a global movement. If you think one child can't shake the foundation of an empire, this story will prove you wrong. It was just after 6 p.m. when the knock came. Mark Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Equity Partners, former 40 under 40 prodigy turned billion-dollar gatekeeper, was exactly where he always was, at his desk, behind a wall of glass, bathed in the low blue glow of 3 monitors and a city that never slept. He didn't like interruptions. His calendar was color-coded, precise, unforgiving. But the knock didn't wait for permission. The door creaked open just an inch, then a voice, small, certain. "Are you Mr. Whitmore?" Mark looked up, frowning. "This is a private floor." The girl stepped in, maybe 8 years old, dark braids, oversized coat, scuffed shoes. She walked like someone used to not being noticed, but tired of that reality. In her hand, folded with care, was a single sheet of paper. She walked right up to his desk. Didn't ask, didn't apologize. She placed the paper down and smoothed it with both palms, then looked up at him with eyes too calm for her age and said 6 words. "Please stop buying homes like ours." Mark froze. He looked at the paper. It was a drawing. A family, a house, a big red X drawn over it. His hand hovered above it, unsure what to say, what to do. The girl took a breath. "You bought our building. Mom says we have 2 weeks left. She didn't cry until the papers came in the mail." He swallowed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Avi," she said. "But my brother calls me Star." Mark looked down again, at the drawing, at the X, and for the first time in a very long time, something inside him cracked. Mark didn't speak right away. The office, usually humming with digital alerts and late-night strategy calls, was suddenly still. The city glowed just outside the windows, but the only thing Mark could focus on was the child in front of him and the sheet of paper that had landed like a punch to the chest. He picked up the drawing gently. It was done in crayon. A 2-story brownstone with blue curtains, a flower box under one window, and stick figures on the stoop, 3 of them. A woman with long hair, a taller child, and a small one with 2 bright yellow stars drawn beside her face. Avi. Above the house, the sun had a smiley face. But crossing the whole picture, red, bold, sharp, was an X. Mark looked back at her. "Where is your mom now?" "Downstairs," she said. "In the lobby. She doesn't know I came up. She told me not to bother anyone." "You're not bothering me," he said quietly. Avi looked unconvinced. "She said this building was yours, that your company bought it, that the rent changed and she can't keep up, that we have to leave again." Mark's throat tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd heard this story, but it was the first time someone had brought it to his desk in person, not in a headline, not in a legal memo, not in a quarterly report with tenant attrition listed in clean font, in a drawing with stars, and a smiley sun crossed out. He set the paper down carefully. "How did you get past security?" Avi shrugged. "The elevator lady asked me where I was going. I said I had a meeting." "You're 8. "I didn't say I had a grown-up meeting." He almost laughed, but it got stuck in his chest. She stood there still and waiting. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She just looked like someone trying to find out whether her voice had made it all the way across the table. "Can I ask you something?" Mark said. Avi nodded. "Why'd you come? Why now?" She blinked. "Because I heard Mom say people don't listen unless you speak their language." He tilted his head. "You think I speak pictures?" She shrugged. "You speak buildings. This is mine." That stopped him cold. "You speak buildings. This is mine." He looked back down at the drawing. not as a message, as a mirror. His building. Her home, connected by red crayon. "Do you have a copy of this?" he asked. "No," Avi said. "It's the only one." Mark nodded slowly. "Would it be okay if I kept it?" She thought about it, then said, "Only if you promise not to throw it away." "I won't. Even if you don't change your mind?" He paused. "Even then." She seemed satisfied, then turned, walked to the door, and paused. "My mom's the kind who always says thank you, even when it hurts," she said. "So, thank you for listening." Then she left. And Mark Whitmore, who had spent a career moving decimal points and real estate assets across digital portfolios, sat in his chair long after she disappeared, alone, holding a drawing, and feeling the first flicker of change. Mark didn't sleep that night. The drawing sat on his desk long after the lights were out. He couldn't bring himself to file it away or move it to the shelf with other papers. It remained there, quiet and powerful, like it was waiting for something. Not judgment, not pity, just action. The next morning, he didn't go to the gym, didn't respond to his usual 6 o'clock a.m. flurry of emails. Instead, he called his driver. "Take me to 115 Windsor," he said. It was the building Avi had mentioned, one of dozens his firm had acquired in the past 2 years. Part of a community optimization package, they'd called it. A tidy phrase, marketed to investors as a way to streamline urban housing and attract higher-income renters. The driver pulled up in front of a 4-story walk-up that had once been charming and now looked exhausted. The paint peeled near the windows. The entry buzzer had tape over half the buttons. Trash bins overflowed near the side alley. Mark stared at the building for a full minute before stepping out. Inside the lobby, the walls were scuffed and the lighting flickered. A woman stood near the elevator holding a paper coffee cup and a shopping bag with a broken handle. She looked up. Her eyes widened slightly, not in recognition yet, but in the instinctive reaction of someone who senses an imbalance in power walking toward them. He cleared his throat. "Are you Avi's mother?" She froze. Did she? "She's fine," Mark said quickly. "She came to my office yesterday." The woman exhaled. "God, I told her not to go. I'm so sorry." "You don't have to apologize." She looked wary. "You're Mr. Whitmore." "I am. Do you need something?" "No," he said. "I came to apologize." That stunned her. He gestured to the bench near the stairwell. "May I sit with you?" She nodded cautiously. They sat in silence for a few moments. Mark clasped his hands. "Your daughter, she made me a drawing, told me about the red X, the rent increases, the notice." The woman, Elena, nodded. "I've lived here for 6 years. I used to work full-time until the layoffs. I found part-time nursing again, but it's not enough. When the new lease terms came, I couldn't keep up." "Did anyone from my office speak to you?" "No," she said flatly, "but I read the letter. It didn't have room for conversation." Mark winced. "I didn't see it," he admitted. "Not until Avi walked into my office." "She does that," Elena said softly. "When something scares her, she draws it, then delivers it, like she's daring the world to care." Mark looked at the ground. "I built this company to do good, or at least I thought I did. But somewhere in the spreadsheets and the strategy meetings, I stopped walking into the buildings we owned." Elena didn't offer him comfort. She just waited. He turned to her. "If I could help—" She raised a hand gently. "I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for honesty." That sentence landed harder than anything. Mark stood slowly. "Would you let me come back? Not as a CEO, as someone trying to understand." Elena studied him, then nodded once. "You can come back," she said, "but this time you walk every floor." "I will." "And you don't wear the suit." Mark cracked a small, weary smile. "Deal." Mark returned the next day in jeans, a hoodie, and sneakers that hadn't seen daylight in years. He didn't bring a notepad, didn't bring his assistant, just himself and the drawing Avi had given him, folded carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. He started on the top floor. Apartment 4C belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Diaz. She opened the door with 2 chains still latched and peered out with guarded eyes. "I'm not here to evict anyone," Mark said softly. "I'm here to listen." She blinked, then opened the door fully. Her apartment was warm but sparse. A single space heater hummed in the corner. Family photos lined the walls. A plastic tub caught a leak beneath the kitchen sink. "I've been here 17 years, she said. "Lost my husband in this apartment, raised 2 boys here. Now they live far away, and the rent went up, and I don't know how many more months I have." Mark listened. He didn't speak, didn't justify, just listened. Apartment 3B housed a young couple with an infant. The father was a chef. The mother worked overnight shifts at a call center. They shared stories of juggling rent, diapers, and groceries with a single income and the rising costs that had crept up after the building changed hands. Apartment 2A belonged to a woman with 3 teenagers. She showed Mark the letter from the management office with the updated lease terms, 42% higher. No warning. By the time he reached the lobby again, Mark felt sick. Not because of what he saw, because of what he hadn't. Because this building wasn't an outlier. It was a mirror. A reflection of policies that favored growth over grace, efficiency over empathy, profit over people. He walked to the bench and sat beside Elena again. "You walk the floors," she said, without looking at him. "I did." "And?" "I'm ashamed." She nodded. "Then you're just starting." He took a deep breath. "I want to change things, not as a PR stunt, not as a gesture. I want to fix what I've broken, and I want to start with this building." "You'll need more than rent caps," she said. "I know." "You'll need to listen longer than you talk." "I'm learning." She turned to him. "Then maybe you'll be different." That afternoon, Mark called an emergency meeting with his executive team. When they gathered, confused, suited, professionally composed, he stepped into the room holding the folded crayon drawing. He didn't place it on the table. He unfolded it, held it up. "This," he said, "is what we've ignored." He told them about Avi, about the building, about what he saw. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up a new slide deck titled "Repair, a Framework for Housing with Honor." "We're no longer just investing in buildings," he said. "We're investing in the people inside them." He outlined new goals: sliding scale rent based on verified income, maintenance accountability councils led by tenants, and a mandatory quarterly walkthrough by company leadership for every new property acquired. "And one more thing," he had added. "Every office in this company, mine included, will now have a copy of this drawing framed above the desk." He held up Avi's picture again. "No red lines," he said, "just open doors." Mark didn't send a letter. He didn't call ahead. He simply showed up. Avi was sitting on the stoop of the building, legs swinging over the edge, a library book open on her lap. She looked up as he approached, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "Did you bring a clipboard?" she asked. He smiled. "No clipboard, just news." She closed her book and raised an eyebrow. 8 years old, going on 40. "Good news?" "I hope so." Elena opened the door a moment later, surprised but not unkind. Mark explained everything, quietly, plainly. The new rent policy, the repairs approved, the shift in company practice. The Community Oversight Committee forming next month, with tenant seats guaranteed. Elena listened, asked questions, didn't let him off easy. When he finished, she crossed her arms. "You realize none of this undoes what already happened." "I do," he said, "but I hope it stops it from happening again." Avi watched the exchange, her face unreadable. Finally, she stood and went inside. When she came back, she was holding something wrapped in newspaper. "I made this," she said, handing it to him. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a clay sculpture, slightly lopsided but unmistakable. A chair. Mark blinked. It's beautiful. She shrugged. It wobbles if you don't sit in it right. He laughed. Kind of like the real thing. Avi looked up at him. Do you think it'll work? Mark crouched to meet her eyes. I don't know, but I'm going to keep trying. She held his gaze, then nodded once. Later that week, the sculpture sat on Mark's desk. Not behind him, not tucked in a corner, right in the center. He brought it to meetings, ran his fingers along its uneven edges during calls, told the story behind it every time someone asked. And when one of his senior analysts rolled their eyes during a board session and muttered, "It's just a kid's art project," Mark responded without hesitation, "That drawing changed our policy. That chair redefined our mission." That kid woke me up, and the room fell silent. Because the truth was clear, trying didn't always come wrapped in spreadsheets and reports. Sometimes it showed up in crayon, with stars, and 6 words that still echoed in his mind. Please stop buying homes like ours. Avi returned 5 years later. She didn't knock this time. She had a name badge now, intern, housing policy division, summer rotation. She didn't need to sneak past security anymore, but she still carried a drawing. Mark was in the middle of reviewing quarterly impact statements when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. He smiled before he could stop himself. You've grown. Avi shrugged. That's what people say when they don't know what to say. He laughed. And yet it's still true. She stepped inside, more confident now. The braid was still there, but tighter. Her eyes just as steady. I'm not here to talk about me, she said. I'm here to show you this. She unfolded a drawing. It wasn't hers. It was a pencil sketch, detailed, sharp, almost architectural, a row of houses, all connected, no red lines, just soft arches between them, like bridges. It's from a kid in my mentorship program, she said. Her name is Myra. She just got placed in a stabilized unit in one of the buildings your company didn't sell. Mark took the drawing, studied it. What are the bridges? Avi smiled. She says, they're people. He looked up at her, emotion tightening his chest. She said the only reason she knows what trying means is because someone gave her a roof that didn't disappear when the rent was due. Mark nodded slowly. I came here to tell you, Avi continued. It's working. He swallowed. You're sure? I'm sure, she said, but I also came to remind you of something. What's that? That the bridges don't build themselves. Mark stood, walked to the display shelf behind his desk. The clay chair Avi had once sculpted still sat there, now joined by a row of drawings from other children. Testimonials, letters, blueprints, legacy. You still draw? He asked. Not as much, Avi replied. Now I teach other kids how to. That counts. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she said, by the way, Myra wants to visit this office. She has 6 words of her own. Mark raised an eyebrow. Do I get to prepare? No, Avi said. That's the point. And she was gone. Still. The following Tuesday, a girl walked in with a sketch pad and quiet shoulders. She handed Mark a folded paper without a word. He opened it. 6 words, written in soft graphite. Can I stay a little longer? He looked up, nodded, and said the only words that ever really mattered. Yes, you already are. Mark's final reform didn't start with a press conference or a think tank. It started with a story. He sat down with his executive team, now half composed of former tenants, community advocates, and people who had once been told they didn't belong in boardrooms. He placed a folder in the center of the table. Inside, drawings. Not charts, not slides, drawings. Some by Myra, some by Avi, some from shelters in Queens, from schools in Atlanta, from housing clinics in Phoenix. They passed the folder around in silence. Then Mark said, We've built a lot of things, but we haven't built security. The proposal was simple, radical in its empathy. The stay clause. Any resident who had lived in a building for 5 or more consecutive years could lock in their rent at a stabilized rate, regardless of future sales or renovations. No surprise notices. No silent evictions masked by portfolio transitions. Mark called it a promise in writing. It passed internally in a single vote, then spread. Other firms took notice. Journalists wrote features about the billionaire who changed his mind. But Mark didn't speak to the press. He spoke to Avi. "I've done what I can," he told her. "Now it's yours." Avi, 19, and already wiser than most policy advisors, nodded. "We're not done." "I know," he said, "but I'm not scared to let go, because you know where to begin." Avi's first city-wide initiative launched later that year. She called it bridge work, not housing, not infrastructure, people. It paired teens from displaced communities with architects, artists, and city planners. They redesigned vacant lots into community spaces, gardens, seating corners, tri-booths, and little libraries that doubled as drawing drop boxes. Within a year, 40 projects had broken ground. One lot was turned into a public art gallery with no entrance fee, just a single chair in the center and a pile of blank paper. Above the chair, etched into stone, were 6 words, "Please stop buying homes like ours." And beneath that, "We tried, you listened, we stayed." On Mark's last day at the firm, he packed up slowly. He placed the sculpture Avi had given him into a box marked "Home." He left behind a single item on his desk, a copy of the original drawing, folded, framed, and a sticky note, "For the next person who forgets what this desk is really for." That evening, Avi opened a letter. Mark's handwriting was as precise as ever. "Avi, you made it easier to do the right thing, but more than that, you made it impossible to ignore. Thank you for changing my life with 6 words. I don't think I ever told you this, but I kept that drawing in my wallet for 2 years, folded, fading, holding me accountable. I hope someday someone says something to you that reminds you how powerful you are, and I hope you always stay long enough to hear it. With gratitude, Mark." She placed the letter in her desk and got back to work, because another kid would walk in tomorrow, and she'd be ready. 10 years later, on the anniversary of the Stay Clause, the city held a quiet event in a newly renovated building on the west side. It wasn't a gala. It wasn't covered by national press. Just a ribbon cutting for a small community center housed in what had once been a neglected property, now repurposed into low-income housing and a ground-floor shared studio space. The building was renamed the Whitmore Center. Avi didn't speak that day. She stood in the back with Myra, now 23, and running her own tenant advocacy cohort. Together they watched as a third-grade student named Ezra approached the open mic near the end of the program. Ezra was small, nervous, eyes darting toward the floor. But she unfolded a paper, cleared her throat, and began to read. "I drew a house that stays," she said, "because my last one didn't." She held it up, a crayon sketch of a building with feet, firmly planted, and tiny words written across the top. "I belong here, so do you." Avi felt her chest tighten. Myra blinked quickly and whispered, "That's the one." Avi nodded. "It always is." After the event, Myra handed Ezra a small envelope. Inside was a folded drawing, not the original. Jason had kept that. Lena had passed it to Saul. Saul had archived it when she passed on leadership. But this was a traced version. A house, a red X, a sun, and 6 words. Ezra read it silently, then whispered, "This was you?" Myra shook her head. "It started with someone before me, but I carried it." Ezra looked at the drawing again. "Can I keep it?" Myra smiled. "No, but you can draw the next one." Ezra reached for a blank page and began. In a different city, Mark sat in a garden. He was retired now, slower, grayer, but still sharp. He read city reports and tenant updates with the same focus he'd once reserved for market slides. A young volunteer approached him with a tablet. "Sir, someone submitted a story to the archive, said it should go to you." He took the device and tapped open the message. A photo appeared, a child sitting in front of a mural. On the wall behind them, a message painted in looping letters. "We tried, they listened, we stayed." Mark stared at the screen, then typed a reply. "To whoever drew this, your picture reminded me what I forgot, that trying is never about fixing everything. It's about being the first to stay. Keep going. I'm listening. M.W." He hit send, then leaned back in the sun. Eyes closed, heart full. In classrooms and shelters, in city halls and library basements, the chairs kept appearing. Folded paper ones, painted murals, stories taped to lockers, no longer asking just to be seen, but inviting others in, because it only took one drawing, 6 words, one open seat, to begin again. By the time Avi turned 15, her name had started appearing in places Mark never imagined. A blog post on youth housing equity quoted something she'd said during a school panel. "We don't need adults to solve everything. We need them to stop pretending we don't see what's broken." A photo of her showed up in a city council newsletter, arms crossed, standing beside a banner that read, "We stayed." She didn't just have a voice, she had direction. Mark noticed it most the night he attended a housing justice conference, quietly slipping into a side entrance so he wouldn't draw attention. He wasn't there to speak. He was there to listen, especially when he heard Avi would be on a panel of youth organizers. He took a seat in the back row of a small auditorium, the room buzzing with anticipation. Avi walked onto the stage wearing a navy sweatshirt and boots she'd probably worn 100 times. She wasn't polished, she wasn't scripted, but she commanded the room from the moment she spoke. "5 years ago," she began, "I gave a man a drawing, not because I wanted pity, because I wanted presence." Mark felt the breath catch in his chest. That drawing wasn't just mine. It belonged to the family down the hall, the girl who missed 3 years of school because her housing kept changing, the grandmother who stayed in her rent-controlled unit long enough to raise 3 generations only to be priced out. She held up a new drawing, different from the original. This one was a house made of puzzle pieces, each labeled safety, dignity, stability, memory. We keep trying to fix housing by talking about walls, but walls don't hold people together. Care does. Someone in the audience stood to applaud, then another. Soon the entire room was on their feet. Mark didn't stand. He sat still, heart thudding, because in that moment watching Avi, he didn't feel pride or credit or ownership. He felt thankful that she had once walked into his office, that he had listened, that he had stayed. After the panel, Mark waited in the hallway. He didn't expect her to stop, but when she saw him, she did. "Hey," she said, like she hadn't just shaken a room to its core. He smiled. "You still draw?" "Only in the margins," she said. "Now I help others draw theirs." "You were remarkable." She shrugged. "I was honest." Mark hesitated, then said, "I'm proud of you." Avi looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good," she said softly, "because I'm not done yet." The first coalition meeting took place in the basement of a library. There were folding chairs, a flickering fluorescent light, and a group of teenagers passing around half-dried markers and cold pizza. It didn't look like the beginning of anything big, but Avi knew better. She stood at the whiteboard in her scuffed boots and faded hoodie, outlining a new initiative she'd named STAY, Secure Tenancy and Youth Advocacy. "Here's the idea," she said. "We partner with one school in each borough, train student leaders in housing literacy, how leases work, what a notice really means, how to document unsafe conditions. We give them a hotline, a resource box, and a space to draw or speak or write without someone asking them to be quiet first. Someone from the back, one of the older teens, Rico, raised a hand. "Why start in schools?" Avi answered without flinching. "Because kids know before anyone else when housing's about to fall apart. They hear the panic first. They feel it in their stomach before it reaches the mailbox." Another voice spoke up. "What if no one listens?" Avi paused. "Then we listen to each other, and we make enough noise that ignoring us isn't an option." The room quieted, then filled with nods. By the end of the month, the Stay campaign had its first 5 pilot schools, and 2 months later, one of the trained students, 12-year-old Naomi from Brooklyn, stood up during a parent-teacher meeting and held up a drawing. It was a building with a roof missing, stick figures huddled beneath umbrellas, and the words, "We're still here," but barely. The drawing went viral, not because of its art, but because Naomi had said, clearly, "I shouldn't know what an eviction notice looks like, but I do." Mark saw the clip late one night. He'd been reviewing blueprints for a new mixed-use project, one that, thanks to the Stay clause, would have 40% subsidized units. But when he saw Naomi's face, her small hands holding up her truth, he shut the laptop and cried, because he knew. This wasn't Avi's legacy anymore. It was everyone's. Avi called him the next day. "I saw Naomi," he said, voice still hoarse. "She's the beginning of someone else's chair," Avi replied. "Do you think it ever ends?" Avi was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think it doesn't need to, not if we keep building seats beside each other." The Stay campaign spread faster than anyone expected. Within 18 months, youth-led chapters had formed in 22 cities. Local governments began inviting teen representatives to tenant advisory boards. Teachers requested Stay toolkits for their classrooms. Even legal clinics started sending staff to student-run forums just to listen. But Avi kept it grounded. "No banners," she told her team. "No mascots. No slogans that forget the point. This is about trying, about speaking before you're fluent, about being seen before you're ready." She spent her days in borrowed office spaces and overnight buses. She met with organizers in Detroit, artists in Albuquerque, kids in motels outside Chicago who passed around a clipboard titled, "Reasons We Want to Stay." Mark followed her work quietly. He had stepped away from his firm 2 years earlier, leaving behind a permanent seat on the board to focus on tenant protections and community investment grants. He didn't want headlines, just progress. Sometimes they still met, over tea, in parks. One spring afternoon, they sat on a bench overlooking a small neighborhood green space that used to be a condemned lot. It had been rebuilt with Stay funds, complete with murals, seating, and a rotating exhibit of drawings from local children. Mark pointed at a poster tacked to the bulletin board. It showed a crayon house with a speech bubble that read, "We only move when we want to." He smiled. "That's new." Avi nodded. "From a third grader in Milwaukee. Said he'd lived in 5 places by the time he turned 8. Mark exhaled. "We used to design buildings. Now we design belonging." Avi looked at him. "You helped me build this." "I didn't build it," he said. "I just stopped closing the door." They sat in silence for a while, until Avi reached into her bag and pulled out a folded drawing. "I got this last week," she said, "from a kid in Tallahassee." Mark opened it slowly. 6 words, but not the same 6 he had once heard. These read, "Will you sit with me now?" He stared at it, then looked up. "What did you say?" he asked. Avi smiled. "I said yes." Later that year, Stay held its first national summit. Not in D.C., not in a skyscraper, in an old-school gym, with folding chairs, paper banners, and a giant wall labeled, "Draw Your Truth." Avi stood in the center of it all, watching as hundreds of children, teens, and adults filled the space with color. The youngest speaker that day was a girl named Rosie. She was 9. She stepped onto the stage, held up a folded paper, and said, "I drew my house because it's the first one where no one told me I might lose it." She unfolded the paper. It was a chair, on solid ground. Beneath it, her 6 words, "I don't ask any more, I belong." The room stood. No applause, just standing, because they understood. She wasn't asking for recognition, she was inviting. Avi stepped onto the stage beside her. Didn't speak, just stood with her. Because that was always the answer, yes. We're still here, we're still sitting, we're still listening, we're still trying. Mark's final letter was delivered posthumously. Avi received it 1 month after his passing. The envelope was heavy, thick with time. Inside, a single page, written in his familiar angular hand, and a photograph she had never seen before. Mark in his early 30s, seated at a drafting table, blueprint unrolled, eyes soft. The letter read, "Avi, you gave me a second life. Not a new career, not a redemption arc, a life that meant something. For years, I built things that moved people, out of homes, out of range, out of memory. You taught me to build things that kept people. I've watched you quietly, and in doing so, I learned what legacy really is. It's not what you leave behind, it's what stays after you stop talking. Thank you for walking into my office. Thank you for placing that drawing on my desk. Thank you for not letting me forget. I hope you keep the chair open, because someone's about to sit down. Love, Mark." Avi folded the letter with shaking hands. Later that week, during a memorial gathering at the Carrick Center, she shared the letter publicly, not to elevate Mark, but to name what he chose, to listen, to stay, to begin again. 2 months later, a new sculpture was unveiled in the heart of the city, outside a newly built community school that bore neither Mark's name nor Avi's. It was a circular bench carved from reclaimed wood and stone. In the center, a bronze chair, not grand, not ornate, just sturdy, and engraved on the backrest 6 words, "Please stop buying homes like ours." Below it, smaller, "We tried, you listened, we stayed." Avi ran her fingers over the engraving and turned to Myra, now running the center's West Coast expansion. "Do you think the words are still enough?" Myra looked at the kids climbing on the bench, laughing, drawing on each other's arms with chalk markers. "They were never the end," she said. "They were the key." And across the country, in a small elementary school library, a girl named Lila sat cross-legged on the carpet with a stack of construction paper and a jar of crayons. She drew a house, a sun, a chair, then paused, and wrote, "You don't have to ask anymore." She handed it to her teacher. "Can this go on the wall?" The teacher smiled. "It already belongs there." Because the wall wasn't just for art, it was for beginnings. And the next story had just started. Mark's final letter was delivered posthumously. Avi received it 1 month after his passing. The envelope was heavy, thick with time. Inlaid, a single page, written in his familiar angular hand, and a photograph she had never seen before. Mark, in his early 30s, seated at a drafting table, blueprint unrolled, eyes soft. The letter read, "Avi, you gave me a second life, not a new career, not a redemption arc, a life that meant something. For years, I built things that moved people, out of homes, out of range, out of memory. You taught me to build things that kept people. I've watched you quietly. And in doing so, I learned what legacy really is. It's not what you leave behind. It's what stays after you stop talking. Thank you for walking into my office. Thank you for placing that drawing on my desk. Thank you for not letting me forget. I hope you keep the chair open, because someone's about to sit down. Love, Mark." Avi folded the letter with shaking hands. Later that week, during a memorial gathering at the Carrick Center, she shared the letter publicly, not to elevate Mark, but to name what he chose, to listen, to stay, to begin again. 2 months later, a new sculpture was unveiled in the heart of the city, outside a newly built community school that bore neither Mark's name nor Avi's. It was a circular bench carved from reclaimed wood and stone. In the center, a bronze chair, not grand, not ornate, just sturdy, and engraved on the backrest 6 words, "Please stop buying homes like ours." Below it, smaller, "We tried. You listened. We stayed." Avi ran her fingers over the engraving and turned to Myra, now running the center's West Coast expansion. "Do you think the words are still enough?" Myra looked at the kids climbing on the bench, laughing, drawing on each other's arms with chalk markers. "They were never the end," she said. "They were the key." And across the country, in a small elementary school library, a girl named Lila sat cross-legged on the carpet with a stack of construction paper and a jar of crayons. She drew a house, a sun, a chair, then paused, and wrote, "You don't have to ask any more." She handed it to her teacher. "Can this go on the wall?" The teacher smiled. "It already belongs there," because the wall wasn't just for art, it was for beginnings. And the next story had just started. Lila's drawing didn't go viral. It didn't end up on a billboard or in a city council meeting. It didn't make headlines, but it changed someone's life. The drawing hung on the wall of her classroom for weeks, taped just slightly crooked, surrounded by other art projects, rainbows, rocket ships, poems about pizza. One afternoon, a boy named Theo transferred into Lila's class. He was quiet, always watching the door, always sitting near the edge of the room. Lila noticed. One day during indoor recess, she walked over with a blank sheet of paper and a crayon. She didn't speak. She just sat beside him and started to draw. Theo didn't say anything, but he didn't leave. He watched her draw a house, then a chair, then 6 words. "You don't have to ask anymore." She slid the paper toward him. He stared at it for a long time. And then, in slow block letters, he wrote, "Is there room for me?" Lila nodded, then added one more line beneath his, "Always." Years later, that drawing would be archived in the Tri Foundation's Children's Gallery in D.C., an entire floor dedicated to the first expressions of trying. A guide would explain to visitors, "This one marks the shift," when the 6 words stopped being a question and started being an answer. It would hang beside Avi's original, and above them both a message carved into wood. "The first try isn't the last." Theo grew up to be a trauma counselor. He worked with displaced teens. He taught them how to speak in pictures when words hurt too much. In every space he designed, there was a shelf of drawings. At the center of his office, a framed copy of the note he once received. "You don't have to ask anymore." He added his own line beneath it. "But if you do, we'll answer." And one day, years into his work, a girl named June walked into his office with a paper clutched so tightly her fingers had stained the edges. She sat, said nothing, just handed him the drawing, a chair, 6 small stars floating above it, and 6 words scribbled underneath in pale purple ink. "Is it okay if I'm scared?" Theo looked at her, smiled, and whispered the only words that ever mattered. "Yes, try anyway. I'll be here." June didn't speak much in her first few weeks of counseling. Theo didn't push. He let her draw. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., she arrived at his small office, walls lined with shelves of sketchbooks and a single message etched into the back of the door. "Try anyway. I'll be here." She'd settle into the beanbag, pull a clipboard onto her lap, and start to sketch. Mostly chairs, some broken, some folded, some with handprints painted onto the backrest. But what made Theo pause, what he began to notice over time, was how the chairs began to shift. They started appearing in groups, clusters, sometimes even arranged in a circle. One day June handed him her drawing without a word. In it there were 6 chairs, each one filled. Above them, a phrase floated like a banner. "No one's left standing this time." He looked at her, unsure whether to cry or speak. She met his eyes for the first time since she'd arrived, and smiled. That spring, Theo traveled to D.C. for a Tri-Foundation summit. He was invited to lead a panel on trauma-informed design and creative belonging. He packed carefully, brought copies of June's drawings, with her permission, and included the first note she'd ever given him. "Is it okay if I'm scared?" The summit brought together over 600 educators, artists, advocates, and former Tri-Project leaders. Avi gave the keynote. Myra spoke about the second chair movement. Sol, now grayer but still fierce, facilitated a roundtable on legacy and letting go. During his talk, Theo did something unexpected. He handed out paper and crayons to everyone in the room. "Draw your first chair," he said, "even if it didn't exist, even if you had to imagine it." The room stilled, then scribbles, sketches, silence filled with soft scratches of memory. Later, Theo collected the drawings. Each one would be entered into the National Archive for First Expression, a newly funded program from the Tri-Foundation to preserve visual testimony from people who began again, people who stayed, people who tried. The archive was designed to do more than document. It was built to respond. For every drawing submitted, someone would send a letter back. Not a template, a real reply, written by someone who had once drawn their own first chair. Theo helped write the first one. It said, "Dear you, I don't know your story, but I know what it feels like to want to sit and not be asked to prove that you need the chair. Thank you for drawing. Thank you for trying. We saw it. And we'll keep seeing you. With you, someone's still trying." That summer, the archive received over 3,000 submissions from 12 countries. One came from a refugee camp, another from a juvenile detention center, and one sent by courier came in a carefully folded envelope with no return address. Inside was a drawing, a chair, a table, 6 small stars, and a 7th, half drawn, at the edge of the page. On the back, "This one's for the next try." June's first try room wasn't built in a school or a clinic. It was in a laundromat. It happened by accident. Her mother worked late shifts and brought her there each evening to finish homework and wait until the last load was dry. There was an empty corner by the back wall where the vending machine had been unplugged and forgotten. June stared at it for days before asking the owner if she could put something there. He shrugged. "If it doesn't block the dryers, knock yourself out." She did. She brought a rug from home, a milk crate turned sideways as a shelf, a clipboard, blank paper, a cup of crayons. She taped a sign to the wall, "Try here. No one grades it." At first, people ignored it. Then one night, a boy about her age sat down, drew a tornado, and left the paper behind. The next night, a girl wrote a poem about her sister leaving for college and folded it under the crate. A woman drew her hands, just her hands. June didn't write back. She just added more paper, replaced the crayons, wrote new messages every few days. "You're not too late. Scared is still strong. This chair doesn't ask questions." Within weeks, the wall was full. The laundromat's regulars started calling it the listening corner. Someone left a flower. Someone else left a tiny stuffed dog with a note, "For whoever feels like a ghost today." Theo came to visit one evening after hearing about it from a colleague. He stood in the corner and read every note, studied every drawing. When June arrived to restock supplies, he didn't speak. He just handed her a folded card. Inside, "You made your own first chair, and then you invited everyone else to sit. That's the work. That's the change. That's you." She tucked the note in her pocket and turned to the wall, then taped a fresh piece of paper at the very center. This time, she drew 2 chairs facing each other, and beneath it wrote, "I'll be here when you're ready." The next day, 3 new papers appeared, and one more question written in purple marker, slanted and shaky. "How do you know when you're ready?" June didn't answer in words. She drew a single star in the top corner of the page and left the rest blank. Because sometimes readiness wasn't about boldness or certainty. Sometimes it was simply showing up and someone else being there when you do. The invitation came in a manila envelope, thick with materials and printed on paper that smelled like fresh ink and ambition. Inside was a letter from the Tri Foundation. They wanted June to design the first permanent tri-room in a public library, a pilot space in the city's central branch. Not a corner, not a pilot, a full wing. The blueprint had already been drafted, but they wanted her voice, her story, her structure. She stared at the envelope for a long time before opening the plans. The layout was clean, modern, symmetrical. It was fine, but not right. Because tri-rooms didn't begin with symmetry. They began with presence. She spent the next week sketching, scribbling, erasing, and then, one night at the laundromat, she saw it. A boy around 7 wandered into the corner while his mom loaded clothes. He didn't draw, didn't sit. He just walked slowly around the wall, touching each piece of paper with the tips of his fingers. Then he turned to June, held up his hands, and tapped his chest. He couldn't speak, but he pulled something from his pocket, a folded page, worn thin at the edges. He handed it to her and stepped back. She opened it. Inside was a drawing of 2 silhouettes, one small, one larger. They weren't sitting, they were standing, holding a blank sign between them. On the sign, 6 empty squares, and in the corner, one line written in small letters. You can help me write the words. June felt the breath catch in her throat, because this child wasn't asking for answers. He was asking for partnership, for someone to hold space beside him, not over him. That night she revised the entire tri-room design. She removed the desks, added soft spaces, collage walls, braille paper, floor cushions that welcomed the fidgety, the restless, the grieving. She titled it The Room Without Instructions. When it opened 3 months later, it didn't have a plaque, just a sign by the door. Here we speak in drawings, in pauses, in questions. You are welcome, just as you are. The first visitor was a girl named Marin, who hadn't spoken in 2 years. She came with her school group, lingered by the door, then finally sat. She didn't write anything. She just drew a page full of waves. June walked by, knelt quietly, and drew a lighthouse beside them. Marin smiled. Nothing spoken, everything understood. Later, the room's new coordinator would call June and say, "We had 50 visitors today, but it only took 2 drawings to change us." June hung up the phone, then turned back to the notebook she kept tucked into her bag. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "We don't open the door for others. We open it with them, and we draw together until it feels like home." In celebration of the Tri-Project's 50th anniversary, the National Archive launched its most ambitious initiative yet, the first Tri-Capsule, a curated, sealed collection of 1,000 drawings from across 5 decades. From shelters in schools, hospitals, and homes, each drawing would be scanned, cataloged, printed on archival paper, and sealed in a climate-controlled case to be opened in 100 years. The foundation asked June to curate the final drawing, the one to sit at the very top, representing the evolution of the movement. She didn't hesitate. She visited the library tri-room before dawn, sat on the floor, lit only by the emergency lights and the hum of memory. She opened her sketch pad and began to draw. A pair of chairs, one filled, one empty, a window between them, a bridge reaching across the space. No words, just connection. Then, in the top left corner, she wrote, "Start with silence. Add someone." She signed it J.R. and handed it to the archivist that afternoon. The capsule was sealed in a quiet ceremony. No press, no speeches, just a group of students standing around the stainless steel cylinder, each wearing a pin shaped like a folded chair. each holding a drawing of their own. At the end, one child, a fifth grader from New Orleans, stepped forward. She was small, wide-eyed, holding something behind her back. Without prompting, she approached the mic and said, "I made something too." She held up a paper. 6 words, written in looping purple cursive. "What if we never stop trying?" No one responded right away. Not because they didn't have answers, but because that was the answer. Later that evening, June sat on a bench outside the archive building. She took out the drawing, hers, the one they'd returned to her for safekeeping after scanning. It had aged. The paper curled slightly, the colors a bit faded, but the lines held. She folded it back into her notebook, then wrote a letter to whoever would find it next century. "To you, you don't need to know who I am, but you should know this. What you draw today might outlive you, and that's a beautiful thing. Draw for the scared, the quiet, the brave. Draw until someone answers, then keep drawing. Because the world isn't made by those who finish. It's made by those who keep beginning." Still trying, June. 100 years later, the room was full of light, full of faces, full of air thick with the quiet weight of what was about to be uncovered. The first try capsule sat at the center of the atrium, sealed in stainless steel, ringed with etchings of stars, chairs, bridges, names carved beneath the surface: Lena, Mark, Avi, Theo, Saul, June. Children and elders, teachers and community workers, archivists and newcomers gathered in a slow, respectful circle. Among them was a boy named Cam, 12 years old, restless, unsure why he'd been invited, only that his teacher said he might like what was inside. He stood close to the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, eyes locked on the capsule. When it opened, no one cheered. The lid rose slowly, air hissing out. The archivist reached in and carefully removed the top drawing, yellowed just slightly, edges still intact. A pair of chairs, a bridge, a sentence. "Start with silence. Add someone." Cam squinted. "What's that supposed to mean?" he whispered, to no one in particular. Beside him, an older man leaned down and said, "It means you don't need the right words to begin, just the courage to sit." Cam didn't reply, but when they passed the drawing around, he took it in his hands and stared at it for a long time. Later, he sat in one of the archive's try-rooms, legs bouncing. An attendant walked over and asked if he'd like to draw. "I don't really know what I'd say," Cam admitted. "You don't have to," she replied. "You just try." He looked at the page in front of him, then slowly picked up a marker. He drew a single chair, then another, then a cluster. Finally, 6 words, his own, not rehearsed, not perfect, just real. "Is this still meant for me?" He slid the paper into the response box. Across the building, a light blinked on, a notification. A reply would come, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But it would come, because someone was always listening, because someone always stayed, because the chair was never just for one. It was for whoever dared to sit. Cam returned to the archive the next week. He came alone, no teacher, no tour, just curiosity. He asked to see the response box. A volunteer handed him a small envelope, hand-addressed in rounded letters. Cam, Tri-Room Response. Inside was a folded card. On the front, a sketch of the same cluster of chairs he'd drawn, now colored in by someone else. Shades of red, blue, green. New shapes added, stars, leaves, open books. Inside the card, "Dear Cam, you asked if this is still meant for you. The answer is yes, it always was. Trying doesn't require a perfect start. It only asks for a real one. Thanks for making yours. Come back soon. A friend still trying." He read it twice, then tucked it into his coat pocket and wandered through the atrium again, this time slower. He didn't stop at the loudest displays. He stopped at the wall labeled Global Tries. It showcased try projects launched in over 40 countries. In a fishing village in Ghana, they'd built floating try benches anchored near docks where kids waited for boats. In a refugee camp in Turkey, a team of young women had turned an old supply tent into a try-room filled with poetry and portraits. In Seoul, students had created a silent try wall. No words allowed, only color and form. In Colombia, the first chair was carved into a hillside with the phrase, "Aquí también se empieza." Here, too, it begins. Cam stared at the displays. He didn't feel small. He felt linked, like a thread in something woven. Over the years, he kept returning. He became a junior ambassador for the archive, led try days at his school, built his own pop-up try space under a bridge where kids waited for the bus in winter, brought blankets, paper, a thermos of cocoa. And one day, when a new boy sat down and said, "I don't think I belong anywhere," Cam didn't try to fix it. He handed him a marker and sat beside him, because by then he'd learned the chair isn't the answer, it's the invitation. 20 years later, Cam stood in front of a classroom at a university, guest teaching a seminar called Art as Beginning. A student raised her hand. "How do you know when you've finished the work?" Cam smiled. "You don't," he said, "because someone's always just starting." He reached into his satchel, unfolded the now faded drawing from the archive, the one he'd received in response all those years ago. He showed them the cluster of chairs, pointed to the one in the corner, the smallest. "This one," he said, "was me." Then he tapped the largest chair. "And this one? I'm still building it." That night, walking through the same try-room where he'd once made his first mark, he found a new drawing on the wall. It showed a garden. At its center, a single chair. And under it, 6 words. "Will someone sit here with me?" Cam smiled, reached into his coat pocket, and drew a star beside the sentence. Because the answer was already there, always had been. Years passed. The Try archive expanded beyond walls, beyond countries, beyond Earth. 100 years after the original drawing had been handed to Mark Whitmore, a small capsule containing thousands of first tries was placed aboard a satellite. It wasn't about preservation. It was about possibility. Carved into the panel of the satellite, alongside solar cells and mission specs, was one sentence in 12 languages. "We began again together." Cam, now older, stood at the launch site. He didn't speak at the podium. He had already said what mattered years ago. Instead, he walked over to a young girl, part of the design team, barely 13, hair pulled back in a long braid. She held something close to her chest, a fresh drawing. Cam asked, "Would you like to place it inside?" She nodded and opened her hands. Her drawing showed a curved bench. On it, no people, just shadows, silhouettes leaning together. Above it, the stars. Beneath it, one sentence. "Try even if no one answers." Cam blinked, his heart tugging with memory. "Do you want to leave a name on it?" She shook her head. "They don't need to know me, just that I meant it." She placed the drawing in the capsule. The panel closed. The rocket lifted hours later, carrying centuries of small courage into orbit. A collection of chairs, lines, silence, and 6 words, always 6 words. Cam wrote one final letter before retiring from public work. He left it on the wall of the Carrick Center, now reimagined as a global gathering space for artists, organizers, and those simply beginning. The letter read, "Dear, next, you will wonder if you're allowed to sit here. You are. You'll wonder if trying means enough. It does. You'll wonder if silence is failure. It isn't. You'll wonder if we left space for you. We did. And we hope you leave space for the next one, too. With you, Cam, below it, a space for responses." The next day, a child drew a chair in chalk, then, in shaky letters, wrote, "I thought the chair was taken. Thank you for waiting." The first Global First Chair Festival was held on the anniversary of the very first drawing. It took place simultaneously in over 100 cities, streamed from libraries, school rooftops, community gardens, and detention centers. No one wore uniforms. There were no official flags, just folding chairs, blank paper, and circles of people, some as young as 5, others old enough to remember the world before it knew how to listen. In the heart of the city where it all began, the Carrick Center opened its doors to over 1,000 visitors. On the schedule, story circles, drawing booths, mural painting, and something simply called the chair carve. For weeks, a team of sculptors had worked quietly on a 6-foot-tall stone chair carved from pale marble flecked with gold. It would be placed permanently in the center's atrium, not as a monument, but as a mirror. And it was waiting for one final touch. They invited a child to draw the inscription. The child didn't speak. She hadn't spoken her entire life. Her name was Miri, and she was 11. She communicated with signs, with glances, with drawings that moved people to tears. She had spent 3 days walking the festival booths, observing quietly. On the final morning, she stepped toward the stone chair with a charcoal pencil in her hand. Everyone stepped back. She didn't ask for help. She drew slowly, deliberately. A small chair tucked beside the large one, then a hand reaching toward it. Then, in quiet looping print, one sentence. This chair waits for someone else's yes. No one moved. No one clapped. No one needed to. Later, someone carved the sentence into the stone exactly as she'd written it, word for word, letter for letter. Below it, they etched her drawing. And beside it, in smaller print, drawn by Miri, who said nothing, but helped the world say more. That evening, under string lights and the sound of kids laughing as they played chalk tag in the parking lot, June stood with Miri in the atrium. She knelt, held her hand, and signed, "You helped us remember." Miri smiled, then reached into her bag and handed June a folded paper. Inside, a single sketch, a wide-open door, and 6 stars overhead. Beneath it, written in Miri's careful hand, "I didn't know I was allowed. Thank you for letting me stay." That drawing now sits in the First Chair archive, under protective glass. It is the final piece in the original collection, but not the end, because as the curator says to every new visitor, we don't close the book here, we leave the next page blank. And just inside the entrance is a table, paper, crayons, a note taped to the wall. It's your turn. Years later, long after the Carrick Center had become a hub of history and hope, the Try Project expanded its reach one more time. This time, to the moon. It wasn't a dream. It was part of a broader educational initiative, a lunar archive, to be installed at a small outpost on the southern rim of the Shackleton crater. Alongside scientific data and cultural milestones, the Try Project was asked to submit a single item, one drawing. They didn't debate long. It wasn't the original. It wasn't even the most recent. It was one that had been submitted anonymously to a try room in Toronto. No name, no context, just a child's sketch. A single chair, half in shadow, half in light, a paper resting on the seat, and 6 stars floating above. Below it, the 6 words, "Can I try from up here?" The board voted unanimously. They scanned the drawing, printed it onto archival material, and sealed it in a crystal case lined with copper etching. When the archive was placed on the moon's surface, gently lowered by a robotic arm, it faced outward toward the curve of Earth. A plaque at its base read, "If you find this and you wonder if trying still matters, it does. It always has." Back on Earth, in a small school in Nairobi, a boy named Jonah stared up at a digital photo of the lunar archive projected on the classroom wall. His teacher had just finished explaining its purpose, and she asked, "What would you draw if someone on the moon might see it?" Jonah thought for a moment, Then he took a sheet of paper and sketched a house, a swing, 2 stick figures, and between them a chair. On the chair, a tiny heart. He looked at it, then carefully wrote, "We're still trying. Come visit." That drawing made its way to the Try archive weeks later and was framed beside Miri's. Below both was a new plaque. It read, "For the first try, for the last try, for the one that hasn't begun yet." And outside, under the sky stitched with satellites and stars, children still sat, still drew, still asked, still waited for someone to answer. And every day someone did, because the chair was never just furniture. It was memory, and invitation, and promise, and the proof that trying once spoken never disappears. It only echoes, forever. The Try Project's final evolution wasn't a program. It was a book, an anthology titled First Tries, A World of Beginnings. Compiled over 5 years, it included more than 400 drawings, letters, and notes submitted from every continent. Each page was paired with a reflection, not from a scholar or historian, but from a child who once sat, who once tried. The project's curators debated how to arrange it, by geography, by age, by theme. In the end, they chose silence. The book would begin and end with blank pages. The first page simply bore the inscription, "You may begin here." The Try Museum opened in the spring, not in a capital city, not near a university. In a small town called Trenton, which had once lost its factory, its schools, its hope, and rebuilt everything from the inside out. A community leader who once drew her first chair in a shelter lobby became the museum's director. The museum didn't display history. It displayed becoming. Rooms filled with paper, crayon, charcoal. Screens that scrolled slow, handwritten messages from across time. Soundproof booths where visitors could record what they were afraid to draw. Tables with no labels, only signs that read, "Start here, even if you don't know why." At the heart of the museum, they placed one object behind glass, not a chair, a page, blank. Beside it, a plaque read, "We made room for your words. Please take your time." No one rushed. Visitors paused longer here than anywhere else. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they knelt. Sometimes they sat down and wrote the first sentence of something no one had asked for, but everyone needed to hear. One day, a child named Ezra stood at that case with a notepad clutched in both hands. He was 10, small, nervous. He leaned against the display and whispered, "It's waiting for me." His mother nodded. It always was. Ezra wrote for 10 minutes, nothing rehearsed, no spelling checked, just real. Then he tore the page from his notebook, walked to the response box, and placed it inside. The staff retrieved it that evening and read, "Dear First Chair, I used to think no one needed what I had to say, but I've decided that's not my job. My job is to say it anyway, and maybe someone else will feel braver or softer, or like they can sit too. Thank you for saving a seat for me. Love, Ezra." They pinned it beside the display, not with glue, with care. Outside, beneath a cherry blossom tree, the museum placed one chair, wooden, unpainted, sturdy, and engraved on the back, "Begin when you're ready, we're already listening." ChatGPT said. Years later, Ezra returned. He was 25, now an educator, artist, and community planner working in an old rail town, reawakening after decades of disrepair. He'd spent the past 4 years co-leading an initiative called Echo Spaces, temporary mobile tri-rooms designed to be folded, rolled, and wheeled into places most systems forgot. He carried with him a new blueprint, one that didn't start with measurements or permits, but with a drawing, his own, the same one he had left in the Try Museum as a boy. He'd saved the original. He carried it in his wallet, creased and fading, the ink bleeding a little from age and weather. He brought it back to the museum, asked to speak to the director. She was in her 80s now, eyes still sharp, hands still steady. "You want to take it down?" she asked, smiling. "No," he said. "I want to build it bigger." Together they unveiled the listening field, a 12-acre park with no set path, just carved trails that led from one station to another. Each station had a seat and a box of drawing tools, a small awning for shade, and a sign that changed daily. Today's read, "You've already started. This is the middle." The field opened on a Monday. By Friday, 1,200 people had visited. A little girl named Ro was one of the first. She came with her aunt. She wore a yellow dress and two barrettes that clicked when she turned her head. She didn't speak much, but when she saw the bench with the drawing box, she walked straight to it, pulled out a sheet of paper, and sat down. Ezra watched from a distance, heart quiet. She didn't hesitate. She drew a house, then a tree, then a small circle under the tree. When she finished, she walked up to the nearest volunteer and said, "I made the chair for someone who needs it." "What would you like us to do with it?" the volunteer asked. "Keep it," she said, "so the next kid knows they don't have to ask." The drawing was collected, dated, pinned to the wall. And Ezra, when he saw it, felt tears in his eyes, not because it was familiar, but because it was new, fresh. A child telling the story not as someone hoping to be heard, but as someone already sure they would be. That night, he walked through the listening field alone, stopped at the final station where a single chair stood under a canopy of stars. He sat down, opened a notebook, and wrote 6 words, not from memory, from hope. "You don't need permission to begin." Then he left the notebook on the bench, closed the pen, and walked into the night, knowing someone else would find it and write the next line. Ro returned to the listening field nearly 2 decades later, not as a visitor, as its new curator. She was 30 now, an artist, an archivist, and a quiet force who believed in the power of drawings to hold what people couldn't always say out loud. She had spent years collecting stories across schools, transit stations, libraries, and even prison visitation rooms. Her initiative was called The Map of Tries, a living, breathing, digital, and physical collection of every place where someone had dared to begin again. Each point on the map held a story: a drawing left under a desk in Newark, a chalk sentence scrawled on a seawall in Chennai, a folding chair placed beneath a fruit tree in a Cairo courtyard. Ro's favorite was one she found in a subway stairwell in Sao Paulo. 6 words carved into the wall with a ballpoint pen. "I sat here. I didn't disappear." She added it to the map. On the day she took over the listening field, she visited every station before sunrise. Most were unchanged. One had a bird's nest tucked under the awning. Another had a new drawing pinned beneath the sign, weathered but proud. It was hers, the one she'd made as a girl, the house, the tree, the small circle beneath it. She knelt in front of it, tracing the faded crayon with the tips of her fingers. Then she noticed something else, tucked behind the board where the drawings were stored for safekeeping. A note, folded carefully, yellowed with time. She opened it. Inside, 6 words written in clean, deliberate hand. "I built this for your yes." There was no signature, but she knew who had written it: Ezra. She stood in the still morning and looked out across the field, the benches, the paths, the hundreds of drawings that had come and gone. And then she took out a fresh sheet of paper and sat down. She drew a bridge, wide, welcoming, spanning from one page to another, on it a single chair. And underneath she wrote, "This is how we walk each other home." She pinned the drawing in the center of the new exhibit wall, added a small box beneath it, and labeled it, "Place your try here." By the end of the day, the box was full. And so it began again, because someone always asked, and someone always answered, and someone always said, "Sit." It arrived on a Tuesday, folded once, placed carefully into the submission box at the listening field's main station. No return address, no signature, just a drawing and 6 words. Ro found it during her evening walk-through, when the sun was dipping behind the trees and the crickets were beginning to stir. She opened the page and stared. A child had drawn a room, not a chair, not a house, a room, but it wasn't empty. It was full, chairs lining every wall, all facing inward. A circle of light in the center, with no single person seated there. In the middle of the drawing, written in bold black ink, were 6 words. "Who do we build this for?" Ro sat down on the nearest bench, held the paper to her chest. She felt it, that ripple, that thrum, that unmistakable tug of a question so necessary it moved the air around it. She brought the drawing into the main archive, framed it, and underneath it she didn't answer with another quote or a program name. She just placed a blank page, and a pencil, and a small sign. "Write your reply. Someone's listening." By week's end, the frame was surrounded by new answers, handwritten, drawn, folded, scribbled. For my brother who never had a room. For my mom who thought she had to be quiet. For the me I'm still trying to meet. And one, written in blocky, determined print. For the ones who ask hard questions, and for the ones who stay to hear them. Ro added one of her own. A small card, 6 words, not a reply, a continuation. "For you, and your next drawing." Then she stepped back, watched, and waited. Because the chair had never been the destination. It had always been the invitation. And the story, the real story, wasn't what they'd built. It was what they left open. On the last day of the season, Ro gathered a group of children beneath the old elm tree behind the listening field. No podium, no microphones, just a blanket on the grass, paper spread around them, and the slow hush of afternoon settling over the earth. One of the kids, maybe 6, maybe 7, asked the question they always did. "Why did you make this place?" Ro looked around the circle, at the paper in their hands, the pens and crayons left uncapped, the breeze tugging at the corners of a half-finished drawing. She smiled. "I didn't make it," she said. "Someone let me sit, and I stayed. Then I made space for someone else, and they stayed, and that's how we got here." The children were quiet. Then one boy held up his drawing. "I made a path," he said. "A path to what?" Ro asked. He shrugged. "Just forward." Ro nodded. "Then that's enough." She leaned back on her hands, looked up through the branches, and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We did it." A small voice beside her answered, "No, we're still doing it." Ro turned. A girl with freckles and a shirt too big was looking at her with wide, serious eyes. Ro grinned. "Even better." The children kept drawing. Ro kept watching. And above them, the leaves swayed gently in the quiet promise of one more season to come. A season where someone would ask again, where someone would draw again, or where someone would try again, and someone always would stay.